The moment lasted exactly 13 seconds. But in the high-stakes world of global diplomacy, where every word is weighed and every gesture parsed for meaning, seconds can reshape alliances, reorder hierarchies, and leave scars that outlast any trade agreement. Look at your screen right now. What you are about to hear is not a campaign speech. It is not a cable news soundbite, and it is not, despite how it may feel to watch it, an exaggeration. This is the reality of power, perception, and the most expensive 13 seconds in modern diplomatic history. Mark Carney just publicly humiliated Donald Trump at a G7 press conference. Not in a private conversation, not through an anonymous aide, not in a carefully worded statement released hours after the fact, scrubbed of any real emotion. He stood at a podium, flags of every major democratic nation behind him, cameras broadcasting, lived to every corner of the earth, and he looked directly in the direction of the President of the United States. Then he delivered a line that made the entire room, heads of state, foreign, ministers, the hardened international press corps burst into laughter at the precedent. The footage went viral before Trump's plane had even taxied off the tarmac. Within hours, it had been viewed more than 90 million times. It was trending #1 in 43 countries. And Trump's response, it wasn't measured. It wasn't strategic. It was raw, visible, unrestrained fury. And every single word of his tirade confirmed exactly what Carney had implied. This was not a joke. This was an execution disguised as humor. And when you understand the setup, the delivery, the reaction, and what this moment has already done to American authority on the world stage, you will see why 13 seconds of footage may have inflicted more lasting harm than 2 years of tariffs, trade wars, and diplomatic breakdowns combined. Let me take you back to the G7 summit in Puglia, Italy. From the very first working session, the mood was tense. The trade war between Washington and its oldest allies was not a background issue. It was the only issue. It dominated every bilateral meeting, every working dinner, every whispered conversation in marble corridors. Donald Trump arrived with the same posture he had carried into every international gathering for 2 years. Aggressive, transactional, openly dismissive of the multilateral rules that the G7 was designed to protect. He had spent the first 2 days of the summit publicly berating European leaders over defense spending, threatening new tariffs on Japanese automakers, and telling reporters on the record that the G7 was a waste of time unless America's partners started showing some respect. The other leaders had responded with the careful practice, diplomacy that had become their default mode when dealing with this president. Polite smiles, non-committal statements, private frustrations whispered behind soundproof doors, but inside the closed sessions where the cameras are not allowed. The atmosphere had been deteriorating for 3 full days. Multiple diplomatic sources described as pattern Trump-dominated conversations, not through argument, but through volume and repetition. He dismissed counter-arguments by talking over the person making them. He treated other leaders not as equals conducting shared business, but as subordinates receiving instructions. And then during the final working session on the last morning, Trump said something about Canada that multiple people in the room later described as the moment the tone shifted irreversibly. The session was supposed to be about trade coordination. Mark Carney had been presenting Canada's position on supply chain resilience, a detailed data-driven framework that his team had spent months preparing. Trump interrupted 14 minutes in. He did not challenge the data. He did not offer a counter-argument. Instead, he looked around the table at the assembled heads of state and said, and these are the words multiple sources have confirmed. Nobody cares what Canada thinks about trade. Canada is a small country that is lucky we buy anything from them at all. If it weren't for the United States, nobody in this room would even know where Canada is. The room went silent, not the silence of agreement, the silence of leaders who had just heard something so gratuitously dismissive that the normal machinery of diplomatic response could not process it quickly enough. Carney said nothing. His expression did not change. His posture did not shift. He looked at Trump for approximately 4 seconds with an expression that one Canadian diplomat later described as the quietest fury I have ever seen on a human face. Then he returned his gaze to his notes and continued his presentation as though the interruption had never happened. He finished. He answered questions from other leaders. He participated in the remaining agenda items, he gave no visible indication that anything unusual was about to occur. But behind the scenes, the Canadian delegation was already in motion. Carney's chief of staff pulled aside the communications director and said 6 words. He is going to respond at the presser. The communications team began preparing for something they had never prepared for before in the context of a G7 summit. Not talking points, not a rebuttal. Framework. They prepared for a comedic moment. Carney had told his senior advisor that Trump's comment had clarified something he had been considering for months, that the era of treating this president with the diplomatic respect normally afforded to the office was over. The decision Carney made in that moment was not to escalate. It was to demote. And in diplomacy, the difference between escalation and demotion is everything. Then came the press conference. The setting was the standard G7 configuration. A row of podiums arranged in a gentle arc, each bearing the flag and nameplate of a member nation. The international press corps sat in tiered seating. Cameras from every major network on Earth were trained on the stage. The atmosphere was tense but routine. Trump spoke first. His remarks were characteristically self-congratulatory. He declared the summit a tremendous success. He claimed credit for agreements that had been negotiated long before his arrival. He described the other leaders as very impressed with what America has achieved. Under my leadership, he made no reference to his earlier comments about Canada. Carney's turn came 40 minutes into the press conference. His opening remarks were unremarkable. A summary of Canada's positions on climate cooperation, supply chain coordination, and Arctic governance delivered in the measured, slightly dry tone that had become his diplomatic signature. He thanked the host nation. He used the phrase constructive engagement twice. Nothing in his demeanor suggested anything other than a standard closing statement. Then a Reuters journalist asked the question, Prime Minister Carney, President Trump suggested earlier today that Canada's role in global trade is insignificant. What is your response? Carney paused. The pause was notable. It lasted approximately 3 seconds, long enough for the press corps to look up from their notebooks, long enough for cameras to tighten their framing, long enough for the other leaders on stage to glance in his direction. He tilted his head slightly. A faint suggestion of amusement crossed his face. Not a smile, not a smirk, but a shift in expression that the front row of journalists later described as the moment they knew something unprecedented was about to happen. The president says, Canada is too small to matter, Carney said. His tone was conversational, almost gentle. He paused again. And yet, somehow he spent 2 years talking about nothing else. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the room broke. Laughter, genuine, uncontrolled, involuntary laughter erupted from the press corps, from the diplomatic staff, and most devastatingly from the other leaders on stage. Emmanuel Macron turned his head away from the cameras, but not quickly enough to hide the grin. Olaf Schultz closed his eyes and pressed his lips together, trying desperately not to laugh. The British Prime Minister looked down at her podium, her shoulders shaking. The Japanese Prime Minister covered his mouth with his hand. The Italian Prime Minister laughed openly, loudly, directly into his microphone. Trump's face was captured by 6 different cameras from 6 different angles, and every angle told the same story. The color rose from his collar to his forehead in a textbook involuntary humiliation response. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. His hands gripped the sides of his podium. He did not laugh. He did not smile. He stood rigid, visibly furious while the room laughed around him. In the footage of that contrast, Carney's calm, the room's laughter, Trump's visible rage became the image that defined not just the summit, but the entire trajectory of his international relationships. Carney did not gloat. He did not pause to savor the reaction. He returned immediately to his measured diplomatic tone, answered 2 more questions about Arctic policy and semiconductor cooperation, and concluded his remarks with a standard expression of gratitude. The seamless return to professionalism was itself part of the damage. It treated the moment as unremarkable, as though mocking the President of the United States was such a natural response to his behavior that it required no special acknowledgement. The mockery was not the climax of Carney's press conference. It was an aside, and that casualness communicated something far more cutting than the words themselves. Then Trump responded, Within 30 minutes, he posted on social media. He called Carney a failed banker who could not run a lemonade stand. He called him the worst leader in Canadian history. He called him a desperate, jealous little man from a country that would be nothing without the United States. He called the other leaders who had laughed weak and disrespectful. He threatened immediate tariff increases on Canadian goods. He told reporters on the tarmac that Carney was finished and that Canada will pay a very big price. Every word of that response confirmed the mockery's thesis that this was a leader who could not absorb a moment of humor without erupting into disproportionate rage. The mockery said, "This man is too easy to provoke to be taken seriously." The response said, "Yes, exactly." Behind the scenes, the White House was in full damage control. Senior advisors had urged restraint before the social media posts went out. One reportedly told the president that the only way to beat a joke is to not react to it. He was overruled within minutes. The communications team drafted 3 different official responses, each more measured than what the president ultimately said. Each was rejected. Staff members described an atmosphere aboard the traveling delegation that one official later called the worst I have seen in 2 years. The second viral wave hit within hours. Side by side, compilations of Carney's calm delivery and Trump's furious reaction set against the audio of the room laughing told a complete story in under 30 seconds. Provocation, mockery, laughter, rage, confirmation. The internet spread it everywhere. The structural trap that Carney had laid was now fully visible, and it was a trap with no exit. Silence would have looked like submission. Rage looked like confirmation. A dignified, measured response would have required the one quality that the entire confrontation had been designed to demonstrate was absent composure under social pressure. Carney had not just mocked Trump. He had constructed a situation in which every possible response made the mockery more effective. And this is where the story shifts from a viral moment into something with permanent structural consequences. Because mockery does something to power that no tariff, no sanction, no diplomatic severance can do. Every previous weapon had attacked American interests. Economic damage, strategic damage, diplomatic damage, but those left American authority intact. A nation can absorb economic pain and retain its standing. A nation can lose a trade war and remain respected. What a nation cannot absorb, what no leader has ever fully recovered from, is becoming a joke. Because jokes do not attack your interests. They attack your gravity. The perception that you are serious, that your words carry weight, that your threats mean something. That is the invisible infrastructure on which all authority is built. Every leader in that room now has a lived, visceral, physical memory of laughing at the President of the United States. That memory does not fade. You negotiate differently with someone you have laughed at. You concede less. You push back more. You take their threats less seriously. Not consciously, instinctively. That is the most expensive 13 seconds in the history of American diplomacy. The footage spread to over 300 million views within the first week. It became the most shared piece of political footage in the history of every major social media platform. The memes were relentless. Late-night hosts in a dozen countries led with the clip. Editorial pages in 14 nations used it as the centerpiece for analysis of American decline. The diplomatic consequences were less visible, but far more consequential. 3 ambassadors from allied nations described a permanent shift. One called it the end of performative difference, the practice of treating American positions with a seriousness maintained out of respect for American power. Another described it as the moment the emperor's new clothes dynamic broke. The laughter acknowledged publicly what everyone already knew privately and once acknowledged it could not be suppressed. Again, a third said, "We used to prepare for meetings with the Americans the way you prepare for a meeting with a powerful client. Now we prepare the way you prepare for a meeting with a difficult relative." The power dynamic has not changed on paper. It has changed in the room. Within days, 2 planned bilateral summits between the United States and allied nations were quietly downgraded from presidential level meetings to ministerial consultations. Japan's foreign ministry issued a statement with no reference to American leadership, language that would have been automatic in any previous era. The European Commission president said in an interview, "Europe's relationship with the United States is important, but importance is not the same as difference." This week reminded us of the difference. Those words became the quiet motto of a diplomatic realignment that had been building for 2 years and that the laughter had finally made speakable. American domestic polling showed that 68% of Americans had seen the clip. 52% said the mockery was deserved based on the president's behavior. Among independent voters, 58% said the clip made them less confident in America's standing in the world, not because they blamed Carney, but because they recognize that a nation whose president is laughed at by its own allies has a credibility problem that transcends any single policy. Business leaders added their voices. The CEO of a major American multinational told the Financial Times, "When I am negotiating with European partners and they have all seen the footage of their leaders laughing at our president, the dynamic in the room is different, not hostile. Amused and amused is worse than hostile, because hostile means they are taking you seriously." A Wall Street strategist wrote, "Geopolitical risk is now geopolitical comedy risk." The footage introduces a permanent discount on American credibility. You can argue about trade balances. You cannot argue with a room full of world leaders laughing. So here's where we stand. Mark Carney stood at a G7 press conference podium and publicly mocked the President of the United States with a line so precisely constructed that the room erupted in laughter. Trump's response, rage, personal attacks, retaliatory threats confirmed every implication of the mockery. The footage has been viewed over 300 million times. Allied diplomats describe a permanent shift in how they engage with the United States. American foreign policy professionals across the political spectrum acknowledge that something was lost in those 13 seconds. That policy cannot rebuild. Can a president negotiate from strength with leaders who have laughed at him on camera? Leaders who know the footage will follow every future summit, every future bilateral meeting, every future phone call. Can American diplomatic authority recover from the moment it became a punchline? Not in opposition media, not in hostile propaganda, but in the actual room where the world's democracies conduct their business. What happens to a nation's influence when the world stops being afraid of its leader and starts being amused by him? Donald Trump tried to dominate the G7 through intimidation. Instead, he became the subject of its laughter. He tried to diminish Carney by dismissing Canada as irrelevant. Instead, he gave Carney the setup in the stage for the most devastating 13 seconds in modern diplomatic history. He tried to project strength. Instead, he demonstrated the one thing strength cannot survive. The visible, recorded, viral moment when every leader in the room decided he was funny rather than fearsome. And Carney delivered 19 words that will outlast this presidency, outlast this trade war, and outlast every tariff and counter-tariff that either side has imposed. 19 words that every leader in that room heard, every diplomat in the world has now watched, and the internet will never allow to be forgotten. The president says Canada is too small to matter, and yet somehow he spent 2 years talking about nothing else.